Sable Strait, Iran, 34 kilometers south of the Karif Coast Highway, where the salt flats collapse into scrubland and broken basalt ridges. 0455 hours, 96 American operators from a Joint Special Operations Task Force were positioned in concealment along a dry wadi, watching a cluster of hardened sheds and camouflaged revetments at the edge of a small airfield called Forward Operating Site Meridian. Across the field, 214 fighters from the Al-Sur Front and 38 foreign technical specialists were dispersed in fighting holes and concrete bunkers, with 12 mobile missile launchers hidden under thermal netting inside 3 steel-framed hangars. If those missiles launched before dawn, a civilian port city 210 kilometers downrange would be burning by breakfast. For 14 weeks, the pattern had been clear and growing darker. Signals collection had tracked sporadic encrypted bursts from Meridian to a relay tower in the Jabal Vesper foothills. Overhead, imagery had shown the same trucks arriving on a 3-day cycle, always before sunrise, always rolling under camo nets within 12 minutes of entering the compound. 3 weeks earlier, a single anomaly had changed the entire problem. A convoy of fuelers had arrived without fuel bladders, and the next day, a cratered strip of dirt behind the hangars had been regraded into a launch apron. The adversary wasn't moving rockets through this place. They were preparing to fire from it. Meridian sat in a natural bowl, low enough to evade most civilian line of sight and ringed by ridges that blocked radar at shallow angles. The enemy had chosen it because it was ugly, remote, and tactically inconvenient to approach. The salt flats to the west were open killing ground for 1,500 meters. The eastern ridges were steep and laced with loose rock that chewed ankles and slowed movement. The southern approach ran through a narrow culvert where a single machine gun could lock the whole corridor. The northern side was the only easy road access, and the enemy had hardened it with a zigzag berm system and 2 ZU-23-2 anti-aircraft guns mounted on concrete pads. The defenders weren't amateurs. Most of the Al-Sir perimeter guards were veterans of 3 years of insurgent fighting, and the technical cadre in the hangars were the kind of people who understood timers, guidance packages, and what mattered in the last 5 minutes before ignition. The objective wasn't heroic, it was arithmetic. 12 missiles on rails, each with a 500-pound class warhead, and pointed at a city that had no sirens and no shelters. The stakes were the difference between a bad news cycle and a mass casualty morning that would change the region's temperature for a decade. The Americans didn't plan to assault the base. They planned to stop a launch. That distinction dictated everything. At 0500, the operation began without the sound most people imagine. No shouting, no dramatic sprinting. The first movement was a series of coded, encrypted burst transmissions, short enough to be swallowed by the atmosphere, and long enough to synchronize every piece on the board. A pair of stealth drones orbiting at 25,000 feet shifted their sensor cones, their synthetic aperture radar painting the hangars through netting and thin sheet metal. A counter-battery radar truck 18 kilometers away spun up, waiting for the first enemy rocket or mortar to reveal itself. Farther still, beyond the horizon, 2 fighters held a silent racetrack pattern, their radars in passive mode, listening for anything that tried to rise. At 0502, 12 minutes before first light would begin softening the edges of the world, the enemy made the move everyone had feared. A generator behind Hangar 2 came online, exhaust venting into a pre-dug trench to diffuse heat. The hangar doors cracked open by half a meter. A forklift's electric whine, quiet but distinct in the cold, nudged something heavy toward the launch apron. The defenders believed the darkness and the ridges belonged to them. They believed the airfield bowl hid them. They believed a launch sequence could be completed before anyone could form a coherent response. They were wrong about one thing. They were already inside a response. At 0503, a small radar dish on the northeastern berm began sweeping, searching for low-flying threats. It didn't see aircraft. What it saw, what it briefly registered and discarded as ground clutter, was a wave of small cold objects moving like insects along the western salt flat. Those objects were not vehicles. They were decoys and sensor nodes, tossed and slid into place by teams that had crossed the open ground in disciplined intervals, using the shallow depressions and the occasional scrub as their only cover. Their purpose wasn't to kill, it was to feed the defense picture with noise at the exact moment the enemy needed clarity. At 0505, while the enemy's attention leaned west, the real danger arrived from above. Not bombs, not missiles. A sequence of tiny parachutes, nearly invisible against the thinning stars, drifted down onto the ridgeline east of Meridian. The payloads were compact electronic systems that landed and immediately began emitting in narrow bands, mimicking the signature of aircraft and false data links. The enemy's air sentries heard it and reported contacts. Their ZU-23 crews swung their barrels toward empty sky, waiting for a target that would never appear. That was the first problem, and it was solved before it even existed. The enemy had set their outer defense to look for helicopters and jets. The Americans gave them exactly that, on instruments only. so their eyes and weapons pointed away from what mattered. At 05:06, the second problem emerged in the hangars. A technical team rolled a launcher into position, and a second set of doors began to open on Hangar 3. 2 launches at once, a saturation attempt. If even one missile left the rails, the defensive timeline would compress into seconds. The response at Meridian didn't wait for confirmation. It ran on thresholds. At 05:07, the first intercept sequence began. 40 kilometers away, a radar array registered the launch prep signature as a cluster of heat blooms and mechanical patterns on the apron. The warning wasn't a guess, it was a classification. The alert tone in the command post wasn't human panic. It was a machine telling humans their window had shrunk. At 05:08, a battery of interceptors, positioned to protect the city but oriented for rapid sector coverage, shifted to full readiness. Power surged through launch canisters. Fire control tracked every relevant sector in overlapping slices. A separate close-in system at the city's outskirts spun up its cannon, its barrels beginning to blur, not firing yet, just achieving the speed that would make the decision final if anything penetrated. At 05:09, the enemy realized something was wrong, though not what. The western perimeter reported movement. The northeastern air sentries reported air threats. The hangar crews reported delays as one forklift stalled and had to be replaced. Every one of those micro-frictions mattered, because a launch cycle depends on rhythm. When rhythm breaks, hands get faster, and fast hands make mistakes. At 05:10, the first enemy rocket arced upward from a shallow trench north of Hangar 2, not a strategic missile, but an improvised rocket meant to disrupt any unseen approach. It was fired blind, a loud announcement that Meridian had begun to fight. The rocket's motor burn painted a thermal bloom for every sensor in the area. Within 4 minutes, 18 seconds, counter-battery computation triangulated the point of origin to a circle 22 meters wide. At 05:12, the counter-strike arrived as a single, precise impact, not an area bombardment. A controlled strike that cut the launcher position and collapsed the trench, leaving a brief orange flash that lit the berm like a camera strobe. The enemy's northern line went silent, not because they had been annihilated, but because their first attempt to seize initiative had been punished instantly. The psychological math changed. They were no longer the hunters in darkness. They were targets inside a system. At 05:13, 10 minutes into the fight, the missiles at Meridian tried to become the main event. Hangar 2's launcher moved to the apron, and the technicians began connecting a guidance package. A man with a tablet shouted to another man with a cable reel, their urgency visible even at distance through thermal optics. The enemy's perimeter guards began shifting toward the hangars, abandoning outer fighting holes to protect the heart. That was the third problem. The enemy was concentrating where the Americans needed them to be confused, not reinforced. The solution wasn't more firepower. It was separation. At 05:14, an American team on the eastern ridgeline initiated a breach, silent at first, then sharp and decisive. A shaped charge cut a gap through a chain-link segment that had been reinforced with welded steel. The blast was controlled, directional, or designed to open a lane without throwing shrapnel wide. 2 operators slid through, their night vision turning the world into monochrome clarity, their IR lasers invisible to naked eyes. Behind them, a third carried a compact thermal viewer that painted enemy bodies as bright white smears against the cooler ground. The enemy's first reaction was to fire at the breach point, a reflex. PKM bursts stitched the fence line, tracers skipping into darkness. But tracers are confession. They reveal positions. Within seconds, a suppressed rifle cracked, and a machine gunner's fire ceased mid-burst. Another suppressed shot, another gap in the enemy's rhythm. At 05:16, while the eastern element moved, the western decoy wave did its job too well. The enemy's ZU-23 crew opened fire into the salt flats, the guns hammering in short bursts, their muzzle flashes strobing. The rounds tore up empty ground and shredded decoys that had already transmitted what they needed. The ZU-23 wasn't protecting the hangars. It was wasting ammunition, and more importantly, it was deafening the enemy's own command net with noise and smoke. At 05:18, 18 minutes into the operation, the first strategic missile attempted ignition. A bright flare blossomed under the launcher's tail. Too bright, too sudden. For a fraction of a second, it looked like success. Then the flame sputtered and collapsed into a messy fireball that rolled under the launcher like liquid sunlight. A faulty sequence, a rushed connection, a human error forced by pressure. The enemy technicians scrambled with fire extinguishers, slapping at an engine that had become an uncontrolled torch. They didn't know they had just bought their own defeat. A missile that fails on the apron is still a warhead, still a hazard, still a problem that consumes manpower and time. At 05:20, as the enemy's attention locked on their burning launcher, the American strike shifted to what mattered most, preventing any clean launch and denying the enemy the ability to try again. A precision strike hit the far end of the launch apron, not to crater it completely, though it did, but to shove debris into the lane where launchers needed to align. Concrete broke into jagged teeth. Rebar curled like blackened vines. A second impact destroyed a fuel point near Hangar 3, throwing a column of flame 12 meters high. The sound arrived late, a deep concussion that pressed into chests and made teeth vibrate. The heat made the air shimmer like a mirage. At 0522, the enemy's command structure began to show strain. Their radio traffic spiked, overlapping calls colliding. Orders repeated. Questions asked twice. Someone demanded to know why the air threats had not materialized. Someone else demanded ammunition at the western berm. The hangar chief demanded protection around the launchers. The perimeter lieutenant demanded reinforcements for the fence breach he still didn't understand. That was the fourth problem. The enemy was trying to respond to everything at once. The solution was to make everything impossible. At 0524, a second wave of electronic emissions rolled across Meridian, and the enemy's handheld radios began suffering intermittent dropouts. Not total silence. Total silence would have warned them. Just enough stutter and delay to make coordination unreliable. In that gap, small unit actions became decisive. At 0526, an American element on the eastern side reached a maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the hangars. They didn't charge down it, they controlled it. A machine gun was set in a defilade position, angled to cover the corridor's length. A second team moved in bounding overwatch, one pair advancing while the other covered, the pattern steady and unglamorous, the kind of movement that keeps people alive. When an enemy fighter leaned around a corner with an AKM, he was met with a disciplined burst, then silence again. The corridor became an American instrument, a controlled space that denied the enemy the ability to shift forces between hangars without paying for every meter. At 0528, 28 minutes in, the enemy attempted their boldest move, a mass rush from the northern berm toward the hangars, and hoping to overwhelm the infiltration by sheer bodies. 46 fighters broke cover at once, sprinting across open ground. For a moment, it looked like the kind of chaotic bravery that can change outcomes. Then the ground turned against them. From concealed positions, American fire disciplined the rush into pieces, not indiscriminate spraying. Controlled, overlapping fields. A light machine gun stitched the front ranks. Rifle fire cut down those who tried to flank wide. Smoke was deployed not for drama, but to break the enemy's line of sight and collapse their momentum. The rush slowed, then fragmented, then turned into men diving for cover that no longer protected them because the angles had been solved in advance. At 0530, at the half-hour mark, and the intercept net registered what mattered most. The enemy had tried to initiate a second strategic launch sequence from Hangar 3. The signature appeared: power draw, heat bloom, alignment. The warning tone returned, calm and urgent. The defense responded in layers. A long-range interceptor launched first, climbing with a clean white plume, arcing toward a point the enemy missile had not yet reached. A second interceptor followed 3 seconds later to ensure the solution wasn't singular. The strategic missile rose, slower than a jet, but fast enough to compress human decision-making into panic. For 11 seconds it was visible as a bright spear climbing out of the bowl. At 0531, it died in the sky. The intercept was not cinematic. It was mathematics at speed. A flash at altitude, a sudden fragmentation bloom, and then debris falling in a scattered rain, burning pieces that hissed as they struck the salt flats. The city downrange never heard an alarm. It never needed to. The enemy did hear it. Every fighter at Meridian saw the sky flash and realized their most valuable weapon had been erased before it could become a threat. Their morale didn't collapse instantly. It slid. Men who had been moving forward began moving sideways, looking for orders that didn't come cleanly. A few fired upward in anger at nothing. Some ran toward the hangars. Others ran away from them, instinctively sensing that the center of the compound had become the most dangerous place on Earth. At 0533, the Americans executed the most important act of the operation, denying repeat attempts. A precision strike targeted the remaining launchers inside Hangar 2 and Hangar 3, not with broad destruction that could scatter warheads unpredictably, but with controlled impacts designed to destroy guidance and propulsion components. Metal frames folded. Thermal optics watched the inside of the hangars become a white-hot chaos of sparks and collapsing beams. A secondary explosion followed, smaller than people expect, but violent enough to punch a hole through the roof and vent pressure upward instead of outward. The hangars became a furnace that no technician could approach. At 0536, 36 minutes in, the enemy tried to salvage something from the disaster. Documents, laptops, any portable intelligence that could be carried out before the compound became untenable. 2 men sprinted from a side door with hard cases, their silhouettes sharp against firelight. They made it 40 meters before a pair of suppressed shots dropped them. The cases skidded, flipping end over end, landing in dust. At 0538, the enemy's final organized resistance formed around the northern berm, where the ZU-23 crew had finally understood they were fighting on the wrong axis. They pivoted their guns toward the hangars and began firing into their own compound, trying to suppress movement they could not see. The rounds chewed into walls, tore through empty vehicles, and sent sparks off steel. It was desperate and indiscriminate. It was also a signature. At 0540, the counter-response was swift. A precision strike destroyed one gun emplacement with a direct impact, collapsing the weapon into twisted metal. The second emplacement attempted to traverse away, and a follow-on strike cut the concrete pad itself, flipping the gun onto its side like a toy. The berm's last heavy weapon vanished, and with it, the last illusion of control. At 0543, 43 minutes after the first movement, the battlefield settled into its aftermath. Fires burned where missile fuel and diesel had mixed. Ammunition cooked off in sporadic pops, the sound like distant firecrackers. Smoke rolled low in the bowl, turning the airfield into a gray cauldron. The enemy's remaining fighters, those not wounded, those not trapped by fire, those not dead, pulled back toward the southern culvert in small clusters, dragging each other, leaving behind the central objective because the center had become impossible to hold. At 0545, mission completion was declared. Not because every enemy fighter had been eliminated, but because the launch capability at Meridian was gone, the remaining missiles destroyed before they could be aligned, and the command and control nodes that coordinated the attempt had been neutralized. In the language of operations, the threat had been made non-viable. At 0550, the first enemy reinforcements arrived from the Qarif Coast Highway, 3 pickup trucks and a single armored technical with a heavy machine gun, only to find an airfield that no longer contained a mission, only wreckage and confusion. They stopped at the outer berm, hesitant to enter a bowl filled with smoke and unseen angles. They fired a few rounds into the haze, a gesture more than an action, and then retreated to the ridgeline, unsure whether the danger was still present. By 0602, the sun was a thin orange line on the horizon, and Meridian's fires were fully visible, black smoke rising into a sky that didn't care. The defensive systems protecting the city downrange stood down from their highest alert posture, their radars continuing to sweep but no longer screaming for immediate action. In a secure room far from the airfield, analysts began pulling the last 60 minutes of sensor data, turning it into evidence and understanding. The story of Meridian would be written not in slogans, but in timestamps, signatures, and the absence of sirens. Final accounting was blunt. Mission completion at 0545 hours. American casualties, 1 killed, 7 wounded. Enemy losses, 63 killed, 88 wounded, 41 captured. 12 strategic missiles destroyed before launch, assessed combined value of $24 million in hardware, with a $180 million launch and support facility rendered non-operational by fire and structural collapse. The attempted strike that was meant to ignite a city instead collapsed under layered defense, disciplined timing, and a system that punished every mistake faster than humans could recover. The Al-Sir front had ridges, darkness, and a protected bowl. They had trained technicians and hardened guns. What they didn't have was a way to beat a defense that treated their launch sequence as a countdown, to be interrupted at every step. The airfield they believed was a hidden trigger became a smoking proof of a simple rule. Sometimes the best defense never arrives, because a prepared defense decides it ends before it begins.